In the year 610 of the Common Era, in a cave carved by wind and time into the mountains above Mecca, something extraordinary happened. A merchant sat in meditation, seeking meaning in the silence of stone. He was 40 years old, unlettered, unknown beyond his circle of trade and family, and in that darkness he heard words that would reshape human civilization. Consider for a moment what it means to hear language that transforms everything, not merely information, but words that arrive with such force, such beauty, that they alter the listener's understanding of existence itself. This is what happened that night. The first word was a command: read. Strange instruction for a man who could not read. But the meaning ran deeper. Observe. Contemplate. Bear witness. The merchant's name was Muhammad, and the words he heard would become the Quran. Arabia in the 7th century was a world built on words. Imagine, if you will, a landscape where poetry was not entertainment but survival, where reputation lived or died by the eloquence of verse, where tribal conflicts could be won or lost through the cutting precision of a well-crafted insult or the unifying power of a memorized epic. The Arabs called themselves the people of poetry, and with good reason. Their poets were celebrities, historians, news broadcasters and weapons masters all at once. In the bazaars of Mecca, in the tent cities that bloomed around holy sites during pilgrimage season, at tribal gatherings under desert stars, poetry was the beating heart of culture. A poem hung in the Kaaba, that ancient cube-shaped shrine at Mecca's center, represented the highest honor. These were the mu'allaqat, the suspended odes, verses so magnificent they were literally suspended on the shrine's walls in gold letters. To compose poetry was to wield magic. To memorize another's verse was to carry treasure. This was the world into which the Quran arrived, and it was unlike anything that had come before. The early Muslims described their first encounter with these revelations in terms that transcend ordinary experience. Umar ibn al-Khattab, a man known for his physical strength and fierce temper, heard his sister reciting verses of the Quran. The words stopped him mid-rage. Witnesses say tears streamed down his face. His body shook. He could not explain what had happened to him, only that everything had changed. Within hours, he pledged himself to a faith he had come to destroy. What were these verses doing to people? The Quran employed a form the Arabs knew well, Sajj, the rhymed prose of soothsayers and orators, but it transformed the form entirely. The rhythm was familiar yet unprecedented. The rhyme schemes shifted with such sophistication that master poets found themselves unable to predict the next line's conclusion, and the content revolutionized consciousness. Here was poetry that spoke of one God, where Arabs had worshipped 360 idols. Here were verses that declared all humans equal before their Creator, in a society structured by tribal hierarchy. Here was language that granted women rights to inheritance, to divorce, to religious standing concepts so radical they seemed to threaten the social order itself. Here were words that named slaves as humans deserving of freedom and dignity. The Quran did something else, something that terrified Mecca's elite. It made ethics transcend tribe. In Arabian culture, loyalty to one's clan was absolute. Right and wrong were determined by what benefited your people. But the Quran introduced a revolutionary idea: moral accountability to a divine standard that superseded tribal allegiance. A truth existed beyond blood loyalty. Justice mattered more than clan advantage. The master poets of Mecca gathered in emergency council. They had to respond to this challenge. Muhammad was, they all agreed, producing verses of such power that people were converting simply from hearing them recited. The poets tried to match the Quran's eloquence. They failed. They tried to ridicule its content, but ridicule required wit that could equal the original, and they could not manage it. They resorted to violence instead. Consider what this tells us. Here were the finest wordsmiths in a culture that valued words above all else, and they could not imitate the speech of an unlettered merchant. They claimed he was possessed, crazy, a magician, anything to explain what they could not reproduce. The Quran itself challenged them. If you doubt this revelation, produce one chapter like it. None ever could, not to the satisfaction of those who heard both. In the earliest days, before mosques or formal institutions, Muslims gathered in homes to hear the Quran recited. Picture these gatherings, 15 or 20 people sitting close in the evening, cool after the day's heat had broken. Someone who had memorized recent revelations would recite. The Arabic flowed like water over stone, polishing consciousness. The rhythm created something between speech and song. The listener's breathing synchronized with the verse's cadence. Witnesses describe physical reactions that seem almost medical in their intensity. Hair standing on end, hearts racing, then suddenly calming, tears flowing unbidden, bodies swaying with the verse's rhythm. The Quran was doing something to the human nervous system, creating states that felt like both intense focus and surrender simultaneously. The content of these early revelations emphasized themes that still define Islamic consciousness. The verses spoke of creation's signs, stars wheeling through night skies, rain falling on parched earth, the emergence of life from dead soil. They described the day of judgment in imagery so vivid it seemed to unfold before the listener's eyes. They told stories of ancient prophets Noah, Abraham, Moses, narratives the Arabs knew in fragments, now retold with new depth and meaning. But it was the daily commandments that truly transformed the community. 5 prayers at specific times. The discipline of dawn prayer, especially rising before the sun, performing ablution with scarce water, standing in alignment with believers across the desert, reciting verses in the darkness before first light. This practice restructured time itself. Life now pivoted around these prayer moments. The Quran became more than text. It became experience. It was recited while traveling the verses' rhythm matching camel gait on desert journeys. It was whispered during hardship, particular verses gaining reputation for bringing comfort or strength. It was chanted before battle soldiers reciting promises of paradise if they fell defending truth. It was the last sound a dying person hoped to hear, words carried into death as a guide. And the language itself began to change. Arabic before Islam was a collection of tribal dialects, each with distinctive vocabulary and grammar. The Quran was revealed in the Qurayshi dialect of Mecca, but its influence soon transcended regional boundaries. As people memorized these verses, as the phrases became embedded in daily speech, Arabic began to standardize around the Quranic norm. The vocabulary expanded, the grammar refined. Metaphors from the Quran seeped into everyday conversation. To say the Quran shaped Arabic is understatement. The Quran became Arabic's foundation. Every serious student of the language would, for the next 14 centuries, begin their education with Quranic grammar. Every poet would unconsciously echo Quranic phrasing. Every philosopher would frame arguments using Quranic conceptual structures. But something else was happening too, something that would prove crucial for Islam's spread beyond Arabia. The Quran insisted it was a revelation for all humanity, not merely Arabs. It addressed listeners as children of Adam, as humanity, as servants of God. It praised non-Arab prophets. It declared that righteousness transcended ethnicity. This was revolutionary in a culture where ancestry determined worth. Early converts came from unexpected places. Bilal, an enslaved African, became Islam's first caller to prayer. His voice elevated above free Arabs in a society that had considered him property. Salman, a Persian seeking truth across multiple religions, found his place in this new community. Women like Khadija, Muhammad's first wife and first believer, and Nusayba, who fought in battles defending the faith, took roles impossible in traditional Arab society. The Quran made this possible. Its verses explicitly stated that God evaluated people by their deeds and faith, not their lineage or wealth. This created a community bound by shared submission to the text rather than shared ancestry. The word Islam itself means submission, surrender to divine will, as expressed through these revelations. As the Muslim community grew first slowly, then with accelerating momentum, the Quran remained its heartbeat. New revelations addressed new situations. When conflicts arose about inheritance, verses provided solutions. When questions emerged about warfare ethics, revelations set boundaries. When disputes about marriage or divorce threatened community cohesion, Quranic commandments offered framework. But beyond practical guidance, the Quran provided something more fundamental: identity. To be Muslim meant to have a relationship with this text. It meant memorizing at minimum the opening chapter, Al-Fatiha, recited in every prayer. It meant knowing key verses by heart, signs of God's presence, promises of mercy, warnings of accountability. It meant understanding your life as part of a larger story, one that stretched from creation's first moment to judgment's final day. The naming practices changed. Children born to Muslim families received names from Quranic narratives: Muhammad, Ali, Fatima, Maryam, Ibrahim, Yusuf. Each name carried a story, a model, a connection to the sacred text. To introduce yourself was to invoke a piece of revelation. The Quran reshaped thought itself. It introduced concepts that Arabic had lacked precise words for: consciousness, intention, sincerity. It created new associations linking charity with spiritual purification, prayer with remembrance, fasting with empathy for the hungry. It reframed familiar experiences, seeing rain not merely as weather but as divine mercy, understanding death not as ending but as transition. And always the verses returned to observation. Do they not see? The Quran asked repeatedly. Have they not considered? The text directed attention toward the natural world as evidence of Creator's wisdom. The alternation of night and day, the growth of plants from seeds, the development of human embryo, the precision of celestial mechanics. These were signs. Ayat, the same word used for Quranic verses. Creation and revelation spoke the same language for those who paid attention. This emphasis on observation would have profound consequences. It planted seeds for later Islamic scientific flourishing. But in those early years, for those first Muslims gathering to hear revelations recited, it created a way of moving through the world. Everything became potentially meaningful. Every phenomenon pointed beyond itself. The ordinary revealed itself as miraculous when viewed through the Quran's lens. By the time Muhammad died in the year 632, the Quran had transformed a fractious collection of desert tribes into a unified community with a civilizational vision. The verses had been revealed over 23 years, addressing situations as they arose, building a worldview piece by piece, creating a people whose identity rested entirely on shared submission to divine speech. But the question now became urgent. How would this oral revelation survive? Muhammad was gone. The living voice that had recited revelation had fallen silent. The companions who had heard verses directly from the Prophet's lips would eventually die. What would happen to the Quran then? The early Muslims faced a crisis of preservation unlike anything they had encountered. This was not merely text. This was God's direct speech, they believed, every syllable sacred, every pause meaningful, every intonation conveying layers of significance. How do you preserve not just words but their living presence? How do you transfer divine speech across generations without corruption or loss? The answer would require something remarkable. A culture of memorization so thorough, so disciplined, so widespread, that the Quran would live in human memory as reliably as it had existed in parchment and ink. In the chests of believers, as they said. carried in hearts and minds, protected by devotion and repetition, kept alive through constant recitation. This was the challenge that faced them, the preservation of perfection, the transmission of the eternal, the keeping of a trust that had transformed them from scattered tribes into a people bound by divine poetry. And in facing this challenge, they would create something unprecedented, a civilization built entirely on the foundation of a single text. In the year 622, Muhammad and his followers made a journey that would change everything. They fled Mecca, where persecution had become unbearable, and traveled north to Yathrib, a city that would soon be known simply as Medina, the city. This migration, the Hijra, marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar, and it marks something else, the transformation of the Quran from spiritual poetry into the blueprint for an entire civilization. Imagine arriving in a new city with nothing but the clothes on your back and words in your heart. The early Muslims came to Medina as refugees. They had lost homes, businesses, family connections. What they carried with them was the Quran verses memorized, verses that would now be tested in the crucible of daily life. And the revelations changed. In Mecca, the verses had focused on theology, God's oneness, the afterlife's reality, and creation's signs. These were the foundations of belief. But in Medina, where Muhammad led a growing community facing practical challenges, the revelations addressed the messy complexity of human society. A dispute erupts over inheritance. Someone dies, leaving debts and multiple heirs. Who gets what? In pre-Islamic Arabia, property passed to male relatives who could defend the tribe in warfare. Women and children received nothing. Then comes a revelation, precise as mathematics. Daughters receive half the share of sons, wives receive a portion, even distant relatives have claims. The Quran provides exact fractions, creating an inheritance system that would eventually influence legal systems across continents. Two men enter into a business contract but disagree about its terms. What is justice here? A revelation, write it down, have witnesses, be clear in your dealings. The Quran introduces the concept of the written contract into a largely oral culture. A woman comes forward claiming abuse from her husband. What recourse does she have? The Quran addresses this directly. Divorce is permitted, waiting periods must be observed, women retain their bridal gifts, multiple witnesses required for accusations, revolutionary provisions in a society where women had been treated as property. Consider what is happening. Divine revelation responding to specific, immediate human problems. This is theology made practical. This is the eternal addressing the everyday. The Muslim community in Medina becomes, essentially, Quran made. Every aspect of life finds its reference point in revealed verses. The rhythm of the day structures itself around 5 prayers: dawn, prayer before first light, noon prayer when shadows are shortest, afternoon prayer while the sun remains high, sunset prayer as the orb touches the horizon, evening prayer after darkness falls. Watch how this transforms time itself. No longer is the day simply work and rest. Now it is punctuated by moments of stopping, turning toward Mecca, reciting verses, standing before the divine. A farmer leaves his field 5 times. A merchant closes his shop. A traveller dismounts from his camel. Life bends around these prayers, and the prayers are composed primarily of Quranic recitation. The opening chapter, Al-Fatiha, becomes essential 7 verses recited in every prayer unit. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Praise belongs to God, Lord of the worlds, the merciful, the compassionate, Master of the day of judgment. You alone we worship, you alone we ask for help. Guide us on the straight path, the path of those you have blessed, not of those who have incurred anger, nor of those who have gone astray. These 49 Arabic words become the most recited text in human history. A Muslim praying 5 times daily recites them at least 17 times. Over a lifetime, hundreds of thousands of repetitions. The words become breath, heartbeat, the background rhythm of consciousness itself. Then comes Ramadan, the month when the Quran's revelation began. A new practice, fasting from dawn to dusk, abstaining from food, drink, intimate relations. The Quran frames this as training in consciousness, in empathy for the hungry, in gratitude for provision. The entire community fasts together. The wealthy experience what the poor feel daily. Social bonds strengthen through shared discipline. And during Ramadan's nights, special prayers feature extended Quranic recitation. The goal is to complete the entire Quran over the month's 30 nights. Listeners stand for hours, letting the verses wash over them, the words creating a spiritual atmosphere thick enough to touch. The pilgrimage, another Quranic commandment that reshapes society. Once in a lifetime, if physically and financially able, journey to Mecca, perform ancient rituals that Abraham himself performed, now reinterpreted through Islamic vow. Understanding. Circle the Kaaba 7 times. Run between 2 hills as Hagar did searching for water. Stand at Arafat in supplication. The pilgrimage becomes the Islamic world's great mixing ground. Arabs and Persians, Africans and Indians, all dressed identically in simple cloth, all equal before God. The Quran institutes zakat, mandatory charity, 2.5% of wealth annually, not voluntary kindness but religious obligation. The wealthy must give, the poor have right to receive. This creates a redistribution mechanism that softens capitalism's harsh edges while maintaining private property. Community treasuries form, social safety nets emerge, the vulnerable find protection. But perhaps the Quran's most profound social impact comes through its stories. The text does not present systematic theology. Instead, it narrates. It tells of prophets and peoples, triumphs and catastrophes, faith and rebellion. These stories become the Muslim world's shared mythology, its cultural foundation. Abraham, the friend of God, who smashed idols and followed divine guidance despite his father's rage. His story teaches that truth transcends tradition, that submission to God may require breaking with family and culture. Muslims name their sons Ibrahim, remembering the prophet who surrendered his son to God's command, only to receive him back faith-tested and rewarded. Moses, the liberator, who confronted Pharaoh and led an enslaved people to freedom. His story resonates with the oppressed everywhere. The Quran presents Moses with intimate detail. His mother's fear as she places him in the river, his sister's quick thinking, his impulsive violence as a young man, his encounter with God at the burning bush, his staff that becomes a serpent, his brother Aaron's support. This is not distant theology, but human drama charged with divine purpose. Joseph, the dreamer, sold into slavery by jealous brothers, falsely accused of assault, imprisoned, then elevated to power through his ability to interpret Pharaoh's visions. His story culminates in forgiveness, when his brothers come begging for grain, not recognizing the brother they had betrayed. Joseph ultimately reveals himself and pardons them. "No blame upon you this day," he says. The phrase becomes proverbial in Muslim culture, expressing the height of magnanimity. Mary, mother of Jesus, receives more attention in the Quran than in the entire New Testament. A chapter bears her name, the only woman so honored. The text describes her childhood devoted to temple service, angels appearing to announce her miraculous pregnancy, her labor pains under a date palm, her son Jesus speaking from the cradle to defend her honor. Mary becomes the model of purity, of submission to divine will, of female spiritual authority. Muslim women name their daughters Maryam, carrying on this connection. These narratives permeate Muslim consciousness. Parents tell them to children. Preachers reference them in sermons. Poets allude to them in verse. The stories become moral touchstones when facing injustice. Think of Moses. When tempted to revenge, remember Joseph. When struggling with divine command, recall Abraham. When bearing difficulty alone, consider Mary. The Quran addresses humanity in multiple voices. Sometimes it speaks directly. O humanity, we created you from male and female, and made you into nations and tribes, so that you might come to know one another. The most honored among you in God's sight is the most righteous. This verse becomes foundational for Islamic universalism. All humans share common origin. Ethnic diversity serves mutual understanding. Righteousness alone determines spiritual rank. Other times the Quran addresses believers specifically. O you who have faith, do not take your fathers and brothers as allies if they prefer unbelief to belief. Radical statement in a tribal society. Religious community supersedes blood loyalty. Your true family is the community of faith. The Quran's treatment of women generates endless discussion and debate. The text addresses women directly. They are religious actors in their own right, not merely extensions of male relatives. They receive inheritance, control their own property, must consent to marriage, can initiate divorce under certain conditions, face the same religious duties, and receive the same spiritual rewards as men. Yet the verses also reflect 7th century Arabian assumptions. Men inherit twice what women do, the rationale being that men bear financial responsibility for families. Men may marry up to 4 wives if they can treat them equally, a restriction on unlimited polygamy that was the pre-Islamic norm. Husbands are described as protectors and maintainers of wives. Modesty requirements, while applying to both genders, emphasize female covering. The interpretation of these verses would splinter into countless streams across centuries. Some would read them as establishing male authority. Others would emphasize the revolutionary protections granted to women in their historical context. Still others would argue for continuing evolution in understanding, claiming the Quran's trajectory points toward full equality, even if 7th century application was limited by cultural constraints. But in Medina, in those early years, the Quran's provisions elevated women's status dramatically from what had existed before. Baby girls, who had sometimes been buried alive in pre-Islamic Arabia, were now declared equal in God's sight. Women who had been traded like livestock now possessed legal personhood. Wives who had no recourse from abuse now had Quranic provisions protecting them. The Quran also establishes what is permitted and what is forbidden, the concepts of halal and haram that would structure Muslim life forever. Pork is forbidden. Alcohol is prohibited, though this came gradually, first discouraging intoxication during prayers, then declaring its harms outweigh benefits. Finally, banning it completely. Blood and carrion are haram. Meat must be slaughtered with God's name invoked. Gambling is banned. Usury charging interest on loans becomes major sin. These prohibitions create distinctive Muslim lifestyle, visible across cultures. The traveler can identify halal restaurants. The banker must develop interest-free financial instruments. The social gathering offers juice instead of wine. The boundaries mark identity, creating belonging through shared practice. But the Quran emphasizes that most things are permitted. He has not placed hardship upon you in religion, one verse assures. The default is permissibility. Prohibition is exception. This would allow Muslim civilization to embrace diverse cultures, adopt useful technologies, engage in trade with non-Muslims, study foreign philosophies, all within boundaries set by sacred text. The Quran's first word, read, launches an intellectual revolution. The text repeatedly emphasizes knowledge, observation, reflection. Are those who know equal to those who do not know? It asks rhetorically. The question reverberates through centuries. Knowledge becomes religious duty. Ignorance becomes spiritually suspect. This creates what historians would later call the Islamic Golden Age's foundation. The Quran commands engagement with the world, study of nature, pursuit of understanding. Muslim scientists would quote verses about natural phenomena to justify their research. Muslim philosophers would reconcile revealed truth with rational inquiry. Muslim physicians would see healing as religious service, all rooted in the Quranic emphasis on knowledge. The Quran creates a legal framework too, not complete law code but principles from which jurisprudence grows. Justice must be upheld even when it hurts your interests. Contracts must be honored. Witnesses are required for serious accusations. Punishments must fit crimes. Intent matters, mistakes differ from deliberate violations. From these principles, Muslim jurists would eventually build elaborate legal systems, schools of thought, analyzing every conceivable situation, methodologies for deriving new rulings from old principles, hierarchies of obligation and prohibition, recommendations and neutrality. But it all traces back to Quranic foundations. War receives detailed treatment. The Quran permits fighting in self-defense and to prevent religious persecution. But it sets boundaries. No killing of non-combatants, no destruction of crops or livestock, no mutilation of bodies, acceptance of peace offers, protection of prisoners, permission to ransom or release captives. These rules of engagement, revolutionary in 7th century Arabia, would influence international humanitarian law centuries later. The text addresses specific 7th century conflicts too. The Battle of Badr, where vastly outnumbered Muslims defeated Meccan forces. The Battle of Uhud, where Muslim overconfidence led to near disaster. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah, where Muhammad accepted seemingly unfavorable terms that proved strategically brilliant. These events receive Quranic commentary, and Muslims study them for guidance on faith under pressure, perseverance after setback, wisdom in negotiation. By Muhammad's death in the year 632, Medina had become a society where the Quran was not just believed but lived. The call to prayer marked time's passage. The prayer itself consisted primarily of Quranic recitation. Business contracts quoted Quranic verses, legal disputes were settled by Quranic principles, social interactions followed Quranic etiquette, names came from Quranic narratives, conversations were peppered with Quranic phrases. The text had become the air this community breathed, and this would become the template as Islam spread first to the rest of Arabia, then to Syria and Iraq, then to Persia and Egypt, eventually spanning from Spain to Indonesia. This same pattern would repeat. The Quran would arrive in a new place, and gradually, sometimes over centuries, it would reshape that society's institutions, values, language, and consciousness. But first, the Quran itself needed to be preserved. The living voice had fallen silent. The companions who had memorized portions directly from Muhammad's recitation would eventually die. How do you transfer divine speech across generations without loss or corruption? The answer would require something unprecedented. A culture of memorization so thorough, a system of transmission so rigorous, a devotion to accuracy so fierce that the Quran would survive intact through 14 centuries and counting. This is the story of preservation. The story of how human memory became the vessel for what Muslims believe is God's eternal word. There is a moment, early in Islamic history, that reveals everything about how Muslims understood their sacred text. The year is 633, barely a year after Muhammad's death. The Muslim community faces a rebellion. Tribes that had pledged allegiance to Islam now withdraw, refusing to pay the charitable tax. Abu Bakr, Muhammad's closest companion and successor, sends an army to confront them. At the Battle of Yamama, victory comes at terrible cost. 70 men who had memorized the entire Quran die in a single day. 70 living libraries gone. Umar ibn al-Khattab, who would later become the second caliph, approaches Abu Bakr with urgency. The Quran bearers are falling in battle. he says. If this continues, much of the Quran will be lost. Abu Bakr hesitates. Muhammad never ordered the Quran compiled into a single manuscript. Should they undertake what the Prophet himself did not do? But the logic is inescapable. The Quran must be preserved. Abu Bakr agrees. Consider what this tells us about memory and oral cultures. These were not people who happened to know verses. They were Huffaz guardians, preservers, living vessels of revelation. In a society where literacy was rare, memory was not backup storage. It was the primary archive. Memory was embodied knowledge, woven into identity, protected by devotion. A young scribe named Zayd ibn Thabit receives the commission. He had been one of Muhammad's personal secretaries, writing down revelations as they were revealed. Now he faces a more daunting task, gathering every verse from every source and compiling them into a single authoritative manuscript. Zayd describes his feelings. If they had asked me to move a mountain, it would have been easier than what they asked me to do with the Quran. The responsibility is crushing. This is not merely text. This is, Muslims believe, the actual speech of God, every syllable sacred, every pause meaningful. One error would be catastrophic. Zayd establishes rigorous methodology. He will accept no verse unless it meets multiple criteria. It must be written down. Someone must have inscribed it on parchment, leather, bone, or palm leaf while Muhammad lived. It must be memorized. At least 2 companions must have learned it directly from the Prophet's recitation, and preferably it should be from someone who had heard Muhammad recite that specific verse in his final year, ensuring the most recent and complete version. Picture the process. Zayd sits in Medina's mosque, the community center where official business is conducted. Companions come forward with pieces of parchment, strips of leather, shoulder bones with verses etched into them, palm fronds bearing ink marks. Each piece represents a fragment of revelation, preserved by someone who heard it from Muhammad himself. But the written fragments are not enough. Zayd cross-references each written verse with multiple memorizers. 2 companions must stand and recite the verse from memory, proving they learned it directly from the Prophet. Only when written and oral testimony align does Zayd accept the verse. Imagine being one of those companions, approaching Zayd with your fragment. You have carried this piece of revelation for years, perhaps decades. You memorized it when it was first revealed. You have recited it in prayers countless times. The words live in your chest, as the Arabs say, and now you speak them aloud, adding your testimony to the grand compilation. The manuscript that emerges from this process is called a mushaf, a collection of suhuf, or pages. It is arranged not chronologically, not in the order revelations came, but roughly by length. Longest chapters first, shortest last. This arrangement has puzzled scholars for centuries. Why not chronological order, which would make the Quran's development clearer? The answer may lie in liturgical function. The longer chapters, revealed mostly in Medina, contain laws and community guidance. The shorter chapters, primarily Meccan, burst with poetic intensity about God's nature and judgment's reality. Arranged by length, with Al-Fatiha's 7 verses opening everything, the Quran becomes a book you can enter anywhere and find completeness. Each section stands as self-contained encounter with the divine. This first compilation is entrusted to Hafsa, one of Muhammad's widows and the daughter of Umar. She becomes the manuscript's guardian, a woman given perhaps the most sacred trust in early Islam. The Quran literally rests in female hands, but paper and ink represent only half the preservation strategy. The other half lives in human memory. And here, Muslim culture creates something unprecedented, a civilization-wide system of memorization so thorough that the Quran survives in millions of hearts more securely than in any vault. The practice of Tahfiz Quran memorization becomes Islam's educational foundation. Children begin young, often before age 5. At this age, the brain is maximally plastic, capable of absorbing vast amounts of information. The child sits with a teacher, usually in a mosque or home, and learns verse by verse, chapter by chapter. The methodology has barely changed in 14 centuries. Listen and repeat. The teacher recites a verse, modeling the correct pronunciation, the proper pauses, the subtle elongations that give Quranic Arabic its distinctive sound. The student echoes back, again and again, until the verse lodges in memory, then the next verse, then both verses together, then 3, then 5. Each day adds more, reviewing previous lessons while advancing forward. The Quran's structure facilitates memorization. The verses rhyme, often with shifting rhyme schemes that create natural sectioning. Rhythmic patterns recur. Phrases echo across chapters, the same formula repeated in different contexts, creating both unity and variation. Themes appear and reappear, each iteration adding depth to the previous. Students develop techniques that would impress cognitive scientists. They memorize while walking the physical rhythm, aiding mental retention. They recite during housework, letting the verses become background soundtrack to daily activity. They use melodious tones inherited from centuries of tradition, the music of the recitation helping embed the words. They review in prayer, transforming devotional practice into memorization practice. A child who completes memorizing the entire Quran becomes Hafiz or Hafiza, a guardian, a preserver. The accomplishment is celebrated communally. Families hold feasts. Neighbors congratulate. The young memorizer receives honor typically reserved for scholars and elders. At perhaps 12 or 13 years old, this child carries in their mind 6,236 verses, 77,439 words in a language, Arabic, that may not even be their native tongue. Consider what this means. A Bangladeshi child memorizes perfectly a text in Arabic, a language completely unrelated to Bengali. An Indonesian memorizer masters pronunciation of letters that do not exist in Bahasa Indonesia. A Chinese Muslim student learns a Semitic language's entire sacred text. Despite Chinese being tonal and Arabic being consonant-based with different grammar entirely, how is this possible? The answer lies in the culture's prioritization. Memorizing the Quran is not seen as academic exercise, but as spiritual discipline, communal obligation, and path to divine proximity. Parents consider it their greatest gift to their children. Communities pool resources to support memorization schools. Teachers often accept no payment, viewing their work as worship. The benefits extend beyond religious merit. Studies show that Quran memorizers develop exceptional memory capabilities that transfer to other domains. They learn new languages more easily. They retain information longer. They develop discipline, patience, and focus traits that serve them throughout life. The cognitive training is real, measurable, lasting, but perhaps most importantly, memorization creates living connection across 14 centuries. When a contemporary Muslim recites the Quran, they recite exactly what Muslims recited in Medina in the 7th century. The words have not changed. The pronunciation has been preserved through chains of teacher-student transmission, stretching unbroken back to Muhammad himself. To recite is to participate in history, to join a chorus that spans continents and centuries. Yet the manuscript tradition is not without drama. 20 years after the first compilation, during Uthman's caliphate, the third successor to Muhammad, a crisis emerges. Muslim armies have conquered vast territories: Syria, Iraq, Persia, Egypt. These new Muslims are learning the Quran from different companions, each of whom may have learned slightly different recitation styles from Muhammad himself. The Prophet had taught the Quran in multiple aruf modes or variations to accommodate different Arabic dialects. This made sense when all Muslims were Arabic speakers, who understood the variations were superficial. But as Islam spread to non-Arabs, these variations created confusion. Iraqi Muslims and Syrian Muslims began arguing about the correct Quran. The disputes threatened to fracture the community. Uthman makes a momentous decision. He orders a standardized text based on the Mushaf held by Hafsa. Copies will be made and sent to every major Muslim center. All other manuscripts, including those with variant recitations, will be destroyed. The decision is explosive. Some companions are outraged. "You are erasing God's revelation," they accuse. The variants, they argue, came from Muhammad himself. By what authority does Uthman eliminate them? Other companions support the standardization. Unity is paramount. If Muslims cannot agree on the text's exact form, the community will splinter into sects like Jews and Christians before them. Uthman proceeds. Scribes create copies of the standardized text. They are sent to Mecca, Damascus, Basra, Kufa, and other major centers. The instruction is clear. Use these official copies for teaching and recitation. Destroy the variant manuscripts. Imagine the anguish of someone holding a manuscript they copied from Muhammad's dictation. They have treasured this document for decades. The very ink and parchment connect them to the Prophet, and now they are told to burn it. Some comply immediately, seeing wisdom in unity. Others refuse, hiding their manuscripts or passing them secretly to family members. A few publicly condemn Uthman's action. The manuscripts that survived this purge are extremely rare. Most were destroyed as commanded, but fragments remained hidden in private collections, preserved by families who could not bring themselves to burn direct connections to the Prophet. Modern scholars studying these fragments find they confirm the general accuracy of Uthman's standardization, while revealing the subtle variations that once existed. The Uthmanic Codex, as it becomes known, establishes the Quran's form for all subsequent history. The text we have today, in any published Quran, worldwide, derives directly from those copies made under Uthman's supervision in the year 653. This is remarkable stability. 14 centuries of transmission with negligible variation. But stability comes at a cost. We lose the texture of those early variations. We cannot hear how the Quran sounded in different companions' recitations. We cannot know what nuances existed in pre-Uthmanic manuscripts. The standardization preserves unity but sacrifices diversity. The physical Quran itself becomes sacred object. The manuscript is not merely ink on parchment, it is holy material embodying divine speech. Muslims develop elaborate protocols for handling it. One must be in a state of ritual purity to touch the Quran. Ablution, washing hands, face, arms, and feet is required before contact. To place anything on top of a Quran is disrespectful. It must rest on a shelf higher than other books. When a Quran becomes too worn for use, it cannot simply be discarded. It must be buried, burned respectfully, or placed in flowing water returned to nature rather than desecrated in trash. These practices reveal how text transcends text in Muslim consciousness. The Quran is not information delivery system. It is divine presence made accessible to human senses. The physical book channels something beyond itself. In mosques, special shelves hold Qurans for communal use. Before beginning prayer, a worshipper might kiss the Quran, place it on their forehead, then carefully open it. After reading, they close it gently, often kissing it again. These are not mere gestures, they are expressions of love, reverence, and submission. Families keep their best Quran in a place of honor, often the living room's highest shelf, wrapped in decorative cloth, brought down for special occasions. When guests visit, the Quran might be displayed prominently, signaling the household's values. When someone dies, the Quran is recited at the bedside, its verses accompanying the soul's departure. The tradition of Quranic calligraphy emerges from this reverence. If the Quran is divine speech made visible, it must be written beautifully. Calligraphers spend lifetimes perfecting their craft. They develop scripts specifically for Quranic transcription. Kufic, with its angular majesty, Naskh, with its flowing clarity, Thuluth, with its dramatic flourishes. Each letter is carefully proportioned. Each word is positioned for aesthetic impact. The most accomplished calligraphers can spend years creating a single manuscript. These illuminated Qurans become treasures more valuable than gold. Rulers commission them to demonstrate piety and power. Wealthy patrons donate them to mosques. Families pass them through generations as heirlooms. The beautiful Quran manuscript is not just text, it is art, prayer, status symbol, and connection to the divine simultaneously. But the memorization tradition remains paramount. Paper can burn, manuscripts can be destroyed, calligraphy can fade, but memorizers reproduce themselves. Each hafiz teaches others. Each generation creates the next. The living chain continues unbroken. Even today, in an age of printed books and digital texts, millions of Muslims memorize the entire Quran. In madrasas from Morocco to Malaysia, children still sit in circles around teachers, learning verse by verse. In homes, parents drill their children on verses. In mosques, after evening prayers, men and women recite together, correcting each other's mistakes, reinforcing each other's memories. The Quran lives in human hearts more securely than in any library. If every printed Quran were destroyed tomorrow, the text would survive complete and accurate in the memories of millions of Muslims worldwide. This is preservation beyond preservation, not archival but living transmission, not storage but embodiment. And this embodiment would make possible something unprecedented, a civilization built entirely on engagement with a single text, not just believing the text or respecting it, but constantly reading it, hearing it, reciting it, memorizing it, interpreting it, arguing about it, living within its language and worldview. This is the story we turn to next. How the Quran became not just a book Muslims read, but the foundation for one of history's great intellectual flowerings, the Islamic Golden Age, where the obsessive study of sacred text launched mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and art, to heights Europe would not reach for centuries. There is a city that no longer exists, but whose influence shaped the modern world. Baghdad, in the year 800, stands as perhaps the greatest metropolis on earth. Its population exceeds 500,000, unimaginable scale for medieval times. Its markets overflow with goods from China, Africa, India, and Europe. Its streets buzz with dozens of languages. And at its heart, in the House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah scholars gather to do something extraordinary. They are translating everything, every Greek philosophical text they can find, every Persian medical treatise, every Indian mathematical manuscript, Sanskrit works on astronomy, ancient Mesopotamian astronomical observations. They are collecting the intellectual heritage of conquered civilizations and absorbing it all. And the justification for this massive undertaking? The Quran. Consider the first word revealed: read. The command to observe, to learn, to understand. The Quran asks repeatedly, do they not see? Do they not reflect? Do they not consider? These are not rhetorical flourishes, they are intellectual imperatives. The text presents natural phenomena, the alternation of night and day, the growth of plants, the formation of rain, the development of the human embryo as ayat, signs of divine wisdom. Creation and revelation speak the same language. This emphasis on knowledge transforms into civilizational mission. If God commands observation and reflection, then studying the world becomes religious duty. If the Quran describes natural phenomena as signs, then understanding nature means understanding God's communication. Science becomes theology by another name. But there is a problem. The Arabs have conquered an empire stretching from Spain to India, but they lack the intellectual tools to administer or understand it. They need Greek philosophy to think systematically. They need Persian bureaucratic techniques to govern effectively. They need Indian mathematics to calculate accurately. They need medical knowledge from multiple traditions to heal their people. The translation movement begins under the Abbasid caliphs, who see knowledge as power and prestige. They pay translators extraordinary sums, the weight of each completed manuscript in gold, according to some accounts. Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian scholars work alongside Muslims, all united in the project of making human knowledge accessible in Arabic. But translation is only the beginning. Muslim scholars do not merely preserve Greek and Persian learning. They critique it, extend it, revolutionize it. They approach ancient texts with confidence born from Quranic certainty that knowledge is good, that truth cannot contradict truth, that human reason and divine revelation ultimately align. The study of Arabic grammar emerges directly from Quranic need. The Quran must be read correctly. A misplaced vowel can change meaning entirely. So grammarians systematically analyze Arabic structure, creating the first comprehensive grammar of any Semitic language. They develop technical terminology, identify grammatical rules, explain exceptions. This work influences the study of all languages. The very concept of systematic grammar owes much to these early Muslim linguists trying to prevent Quranic misreading. The science of hadith, studying the Prophet's words and deeds, grows from the need to understand Quranic context. A verse says, "Establish prayer," but how? What are the precise movements? What words should be recited? Muhammad's practice clarifies the Quran's commands, so collecting and verifying his statements becomes crucial. This leads to development of historical methodology. Chains of transmission must be documented. Transmitters' reliability must be evaluated. Forgeries must be identified. Medieval Muslim scholars create techniques of textual criticism that would not appear in Europe for centuries. Islamic law fiqh extracts principles from Quranic verses and prophetic practice, then applies them to situations the 7th century never imagined. What does the Quran's prohibition of alcohol mean for medications containing alcohol? If the text mandates amputation for theft, what counts as theft? What minimum value? Under what circumstances? With what evidence? The jurists develop elaborate methodologies: analogical reasoning, consideration of public interest, scholarly consensus, examining legislative intent. 4 major schools of Sunni jurisprudence emerge, each with distinct approaches, but all rooted in Quranic exegesis. Philosophy flourishes as Muslim thinkers engage Greek thought. Al-Kindi, the first major Islamic philosopher, sees no contradiction between reason and revelation. Al-Farabi tries to reconcile Plato's ideal state with Islamic governance. Ibn Sina Avicenna in the West creates a massive philosophical system, synthesizing Aristotelian logic with Islamic theology. These are not mere commentators on Greek texts. They are original thinkers using Greek tools to address Islamic questions, creating new philosophical traditions that would profoundly influence medieval Christian and Jewish thought. But perhaps the most dramatic impact comes in mathematics and science. Muslim scholars inherit Indian numerals, including the revolutionary concept of zero, and transmit them to Europe. The word algorithm comes from Al-Khwarizmi, whose 9th century mathematical treatises introduce algebra as systematic discipline. The word algebra itself comes from the Arabic al-jab. Muslim mathematicians developed trigonometry far beyond Greek achievements, driven partly by need to calculate prayer times and determine the direction to Mecca from any location on earth. Astronomy becomes Islamic science par excellence. The Quran refers to celestial movements as signs, and practical needs demand astronomical precision, knowing prayer times, starting the fast at dawn, citing the new moon to begin Ramadan. Muslim astronomers build observatories, chart stellar positions more accurately than the Greeks, correct Ptolemaic errors, develop new astronomical instruments. The astrolabe, that ingenious device for measuring celestial positions, reaches its most sophisticated form in Muslim hands. Medicine draws inspiration from Quranic verses about healing and the Prophet's statements about treating illness. God has not sent down a disease without sending down a cure for it, Muhammad reportedly said. This creates religious imperative to discover those cures. Muslim physicians translate Greek and Indian medical texts, then advance far beyond them. Al-Razi Rhazes in Latin writes the first accurate descriptions of smallpox and measles. Ibn al-Nafis describes pulmonary circulation 3 centuries before Europeans. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine becomes the standard medical text in Europe for 500 years. Chemistry, the word itself from Arabic alchemia, develops partly from alchemical pursuits but quickly becomes systematic study of substances and transformations. Jabir ibn Hayyan describes numerous chemical processes: distillation, crystallization, dissolution, sublimation. He identifies acids and bases, develops apparatus for chemical experiments, creates classification systems for substances. Muslim chemists produce detailed descriptions of hundreds of chemical reactions, creating foundations for modern chemistry. The pursuit of knowledge spreads from elite circles to broader society. Cities develop extensive library systems. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad allegedly holds 400,000 books. Córdoba's library in Muslim Spain contains 600,000 volumes at a time when the largest European monastery libraries hold perhaps a few hundred. Private collectors amass thousands of books. One 10th century official reportedly needs 400 camels to transport his personal library. Public hospitals emerge, offering free treatment based on Islamic principles of charity. These are not just places to die, but institutions for healing. They include wards for different diseases, pharmacies, medical libraries, lecture halls where physicians teach. Mental illness receives compassionate treatment rather than demonic explanation. The wealthy and poor receive care side by side, Islamic egalitarianism in practice. Universities develop the madrasa system, where students study for years, receiving stipends, room and board. The curriculum always begins with Quranic studies but expands to include law, theology, medicine, mathematics, astronomy. Standards emerge. Scholars must master prerequisite knowledge and demonstrate competence to their teachers, receive certification ijaza, authorizing them to teach. This is the ancestor of modern academic degrees. But alongside this intellectual flowering, another Quranic engagement emerges: the art of recitation. If the Quran is divine speech, its sound carries sacred significance. The way verses are recited, the melody, the rhythm, the emotional coloring becomes its own discipline, requiring decades of mastery. The rules of tajweed proper, Quranic recitation, develop into elaborate science. Each Arabic letter must be pronounced from its precise articulation point in the mouth or throat. Vowel lengths must be exact. Certain letters require nasalization, others need emphasis. Rules govern when to pause, when to continue, how to handle consecutive similar letters. Students spend years learning these technicalities, training their mouths and voices to produce sounds that match the Prophet's recitation as transmitted through chains of teachers. The maqamat melodic modes transform recitation into musical experience without using instruments, which many Muslims view suspiciously. A skilled reciter modulates between modes according to verse content. Joyful verses receive uplifting melodies. Warnings come in somber tones. Narratives flow in engaging rhythms. The human voice becomes orchestra. The Quran becomes symphony. Master reciters achieve celebrity status. Their recitations draw crowds who listen not just for content, but for beauty. When a gifted reciter performs, listeners weep openly, overcome by the combination of sacred text and sublime sound. Recordings of famous reciters, first on radio, then cassettes, now digital formats, spread worldwide. Muslims develop preferences for particular reciters the way others favor certain musicians. International Quran competitions emerge, where young reciters demonstrate their skill before expert judges. The standards are exacting. Pronunciation must be flawless, rules perfectly applied, melody appropriate, emotion genuine but not theatrical. Winners become national heroes, their recitations played in mosques and homes, their techniques studied by aspiring reciters. This is more than performance art. Recitation is worship, communication with the divine through the medium of divinely revealed language. The reciter is not creating but transmitting, channeling words that originated beyond human invention. Done properly, recitation transports both reciter and listeners into spiritual states, presence, devotion, transcendence. The visual Quran develops alongside the auditory. Islamic art traditionally avoids depicting humans or animals in religious contexts, partly from concern about idolatry. This restriction channels artistic energy into calligraphy and geometric patterns. If you cannot paint God's creatures, you can beautify God's words. Quranic calligraphy becomes the Islamic world's supreme visual art. The earliest Kufic script, angular, geometric, majestic, makes Quranic manuscripts look like architectural blueprints for paradise. Later scripts like Naskh offer clarity and readability. Thuluth provides dramatic flourishes suitable for mosque decoration. Diwani creates intricate compositions where letters interweave like vines. Calligraphers train for decades, learning not just letter forms but proportional systems based on dot measurements, pen cutting techniques, ink preparation, paper treatment. The greatest calligraphers achieve mystical status. Their work is not mere writing, but meditation, prayer, and art simultaneously. Illuminated Qurans represent pinnacles of Islamic artistic achievement. Gold leaf highlights key passages. Lapis lazuli provides brilliant blue, intricate geometric patterns, arabesques and tessellations of infinite complexity frame verses. These manuscripts take years to produce, requiring collaboration between calligraphers, illuminators, and binders. The finished work is not just book but sacred object, treasure, and demonstration of devotion. Mosque architecture centers on accommodating Quranic recitation and display. The dome's shape provides acoustic resonance, amplifying the reciter's voice naturally. The mihrab prayer niche indicating Mecca's direction becomes focus of architectural and calligraphic elaboration, often covered entirely in Quranic verses. Walls bear Quranic inscriptions rather than figurative art. The building itself becomes three-dimensional Quran. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, completed in the year 691, features hundreds of meters of Quranic verses in gold mosaic. Walk through that sacred space, and you are surrounded by divine speech made visible. The great mosque of Cordoba's horseshoe arches create forest of columns punctuated by Quranic calligraphy. The Alhambra's walls seem to dissolve into words, poetry, and Quranic verses, interweaving until the boundary blurs. This obsessive engagement with the Quran, linguistic, legal, philosophical, scientific, artistic, musical, creates civilization with distinctive character. Knowledge is religious duty. Beauty serves sacred purposes. Mathematics helps fulfill worship obligations. Medicine implements divine compassion. The mundane becomes charged with meaning because everything can be brought into relationship with revelation. But the Islamic world is not monolithic. As the civilization expands, it encounters vast cultural diversity. The Quran, unchanged in Arabic, meets Persians, Turks, Berbers, South Asians, Southeast Asians, Sub-Saharan Africans, Central Asians, each bringing their own languages, customs, and traditions. How does a single text maintain unity across such diversity? The answer lies partly in Arabic's status as sacred language. The Quran must be recited in Arabic for ritual validity. A Persian Muslim praying in Tehran, a Malay Muslim praying in Jakarta, a Berber Muslim praying in Morocco, all recite the same Arabic verses. This creates linguistic unity amid ethnic diversity. Arabic becomes the Islamic world's Latin, the language of scholarship and administration, even when not native tongue. But translation enables understanding. By the 10th century, Persian translations of Quranic meaning appear, though never replacing the Arabic original. Turkish translations follow. Eventually, translations exist in dozens of languages, each helping non-Arabs grasp the text's message while acknowledging that translation can never fully capture the original. The Quran's flexibility allows it to speak to radically different contexts. Persian Sufis, Islamic mystics, find in Quranic verses about divine love and nearness a confirmation of their ecstatic spirituality. Turkish warriors find in verses about jihad justification for Ottoman expansion. Indian scholars find in verses about knowledge validation of their mathematical and astronomical pursuits. West African Muslims find in verses about community the basis for their distinctive social structures. This is the Quran's peculiar power, to remain fixed in form while generating infinite interpretations. The words never change, but their meanings multiply through cultural lenses. A single verse can support contemplative mysticism, rigorous legalism, militant activism, quietist withdrawal depending on emphasis, context, and interpreters' concerns. The commentary tradition, tafsir, grows to massive proportions. Early commentators focus on linguistic meaning and historical context. Later scholars add theological, legal, and mystical dimensions. Some commentaries run to dozens of volumes, analyzing each verse from multiple angles, quoting earlier authorities, offering original insights. The greatest commentators are revered as saints, their wisdom seen as divinely guided understanding of divine speech. By the 13th century, Islamic civilization has produced scientific advances. Europe will not match for centuries. Medical knowledge surpassing ancient achievements, philosophical sophistication unknown to contemporary Christendom, artistic traditions of astounding beauty, and literary culture of vast range and depth. And all of it traces back, directly or indirectly, to obsessive engagement with the Quran. This is what a civilization built on a single text looks like. Not merely believing the text, but making it the center of intellectual life, the inspiration for scientific inquiry, the source of legal systems, the foundation of artistic expression, the rhythm of daily existence. The Islamic Golden Age represents perhaps the fullest expression of Quranic civilization, but the Quran would continue to shape cultures long after Baghdad's power faded. As Islam spread beyond Arabic-speaking lands into regions with ancient civilizations and distinct traditions, the Quran would prove remarkably adaptable, maintaining its Arabic core while allowing cultural expression to flourish around it. This is the story we turn to next, how the unchanging Quran met the changing world, how one text spawned 1,000 cultural expressions, how Muslims from Morocco to Malaysia found their identities both within Quranic unity and their own distinctive traditions. In the year 711, an army crosses from North Africa into Spain. Within 7 years, most of the Iberian Peninsula is under Muslim control. The conquest is military, but the transformation is cultural. The Quran has arrived in Europe. Al-Andalus, as Muslims call their Iberian territories, becomes something unprecedented, a place where the Quran meets European Christianity face to face, where Islamic civilization develops on European soil, where 3 religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, coexist in complex, sometimes harmonious, often tense proximity, and the Quran shapes this multicultural experiment in distinctive ways. Picture Cordoba in the year 1000. It is Europe's largest city, rivaling Baghdad and Constantinople. Its population exceeds 400,000. Its streets are paved and lit at night, unheard of luxury in medieval Europe. Its library contains hundreds of thousands of volumes. And at its heart stands the Great Mosque, whose horseshoe arches and Quranic inscriptions create space both architecturally magnificent and spiritually charged. Spanish Muslims developed their own relationship with the Quran, one inflected by European aesthetics and Christian proximity. The Maghrebi script emerges a calligraphic style distinct from Middle Eastern forms, with rounded letters and distinctive flourishes. Quranic manuscripts from Al-Andalus look different from their Baghdad counterparts, revealing how local artistic traditions shape sacred texts' visual presentation. The intellectual tradition takes distinctive flavor too. Andalusian scholars engage deeply with Greek philosophy Cordoba produces. Ibn Rushd, Averroes to Europeans, whose commentaries on Aristotle would profoundly influence medieval Christian thought. His project, demonstrating that Quranic revelation and philosophical reason lead to the same truths. European Christian scholars later study his Arabic works in Latin translation, learning Aristotle through Muslim interpretation. But Al-Andalus is not the Quran's only European encounter. Far to the east, in the Balkans and Anatolia, Turkish Muslims bring the Quran into lands that had been Christian for a millennium. The Ottoman Empire that emerges would carry Islam to the gates of Vienna, ruling Christian majority populations while maintaining Islamic legal systems rooted in Quranic principles. Turkish culture creates its own Quranic aesthetic. Ottoman calligraphers developed new scripts, particularly the elaborate Diwani style used for imperial decrees and Quranic manuscripts. Ottoman mosques reach architectural heights that earlier Islamic architecture never achieved. Massive domes inspired partly by Byzantine Hagia Sophia, intricate tile work featuring floral and geometric patterns, soaring minarets visible across cityscapes. The Topkapi Palace in Istanbul houses one of Islam's greatest treasures, a Quran manuscript attributed to Uthman himself, allegedly stained with his blood when assassins killed him while reading it. Whether authentic or not, the manuscript represents Turkish Muslims' claim to custodianship of Islam's heritage. Pilgrims visit to pray near this sacred object, to touch their foreheads to the case containing it, to feel connection across centuries. Turkish religious practice develops distinctive characteristics. The highly traditional artistic rendering of Muhammad's physical description creates elaborate calligraphic compositions, combining Quranic verses with hadith descriptions of the Prophet. These are not portraits, which remain forbidden, but verbal descriptions arranged in visually stunning patterns. They hang in homes and mosques, providing visual focus for devotion without depicting the human form. Now turn your attention eastward, to Persia. When Arabs conquered Persia in the 7th century, they encountered one of history's great civilizations, sophisticated, literate, with thousand-year-old cultural traditions. Persians initially resisted Islam, then gradually converted, and eventually created distinctive Islamic culture deeply marked by pre-Islamic Persian heritage. Persian becomes the first major non-Arabic Islamic language, developing a rich literary tradition saturated with Quranic themes and allusions. The great Persian poets, Rumi, Hafez, Saadi, Ferdowsi, fill their verses with Quranic references. A line of Persian poetry might allude to the Quranic story of Joseph, reference a verse about divine love, employ metaphors from Quranic descriptions of paradise, all while addressing decidedly Persian concerns about love, wine, and mystical union. Rumi, the 13th century mystic poet, uses Quranic imagery to describe spiritual longing. His Masnavi, a massive poetic work, retells Quranic stories with mystical interpretation. Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush becomes metaphor for the soul's illumination. Joseph's beauty represents divine attraction drawing seekers. The Quran provides Rumi's vocabulary for expressing experiences that transcend words. Persian miniature painting develops a tradition of illustrating Quranic narratives while navigating the prohibition on depicting prophets. The artists paint the scenes: Moses parting the Red Sea, Joseph being pulled from the well, Jesus speaking from the cradle, but leave prophets' faces blank or veiled or turned away. The paintings show the event without showing the holy person, respecting prohibition while satisfying desire to visualize sacred stories. Persian Shia Muslims develop distinctive Quranic interpretation, emphasizing verses about Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. They read certain verses as coded references to Ali's spiritual authority. The verse about those firmly rooted in knowledge, Ali and his descendants. The verse commanding obedience to those in authority among you, the Imams from Ali's lineage. The same Quran, but seen through distinctly Shia lens that highlights certain passages and interprets them in ways Sunni Muslims reject. Cross the mountains into South Asia. Islam arrives in India gradually through traders, Sufi missionaries, and eventually conquest. The Quran encounters Hindu civilization with its own ancient scriptures, complex philosophies, and devotional traditions. The interaction produces synthesis unlike anywhere else. Indian Muslims develop unique Quranic recitation styles, blending Arabic pronunciation with subcontinental musical sensibilities. The melodies sound different from Arab reciters, more ornamented, drawing on centuries of Indian classical music tradition. Some conservative scholars criticize this as innovation, but it endures, showing how local aesthetics shape sacred sound. Sufi orders, mystical brotherhoods that emphasize direct experience of God, flourish in South Asia. They use the Quran in distinctive ways. Qawwali music develops devotional singing that incorporates Quranic verses into ecstatic performances, with rhythmic clapping, repetitive phrases building to climax, audiences swaying and sometimes dancing despite orthodox disapproval. This is the Quran as pathway to altered consciousness, divine presence accessed through sacred words combined with music and community. The Chishti order, one of South Asia's major Sufi lineages, develops practice of sama, listening to Quranic recitation and poetry as spiritual discipline. Devotees gather in the evening at a pir's, master's residence, or at a saint's tomb. The recitation begins quietly, Quranic verses in beautiful voice. Then poetry in Persian or Urdu, dense with Quranic allusions. The music builds. Some listeners weep, others enter trance states. The Quran here is not primarily legal text or historical document, but key to mystical experience. Indian Muslim architecture reflects synthesis too. The Taj Mahal, that monument to love built by Shah Jahan for his wife, is covered with Quranic verses. The calligraphy wraps around doorways, runs along walls, frames windows. The building itself becomes three-dimensional Quran, love monument and sacred text simultaneously. The verses selected emphasize paradise, eternal life, divine mercy, fitting for a tomb, but also elevating romantic love to sacred status. Move further east to Indonesia and Malaysia. Islam arrives here remarkably peacefully, carried by traders and Sufi missionaries. The Quran encounters cultures that are neither Arab nor Persian, languages unrelated to Semitic roots, societies structured by different principles entirely. Southeast Asian Muslims develop Jawi script Arabic letters adapted for writing Malay. This creates literature that looks Arabic but conveys Malay language, Quranic phrases mixing with local vocabulary. Religious texts in Jawi saturate everyday language with Arabic words from the Quran, so that speaking Malay in Islamic context means constantly using Quranic terminology. Indonesian Quranic recitation develops its own style, slower, more measured than Middle Eastern recitation, with particular attention to the melodic aspects. Indonesian reciters win international competitions regularly, their style appreciated for its beauty and precision. The country holds its own national competitions, attracting millions of viewers, Quranic recitation as mass entertainment, sacred and popular simultaneously. Javanese Muslims practice Salamatan communal meal gatherings, where Quranic recitation plays central role. The host prepares food, invites neighbors, and hires someone to recite the Quran. The recitation sanctifies the occasion, whether celebration or commemoration. This is the Quran as social glue, binding communities through shared listening to sacred text. Travel west across the Indian Ocean to East Africa. Islam comes here early. Muslims fleeing persecution in Mecca found refuge in Abyssinia in the Prophet's lifetime. Swahili culture develops on the coast, blending African, Arab, and South Asian elements. The Swahili language itself reflects this, mixing Bantu grammar with extensive Arabic vocabulary, much of it Quranic. East African Quranic schools, madrasa, develop distinctive character. Children sit on the ground, writing verses on wooden boards with ink made from soot and water. They memorize verse by verse, washing the board clean when ready for the next section. The act of washing becomes part of the ritual, words dissolving back into water, but remaining in memory. In West Africa, Islam spreads through the Sahara via trade routes. The Quran reaches Timbuktu, which becomes major center of Islamic learning. Scholars accumulate vast libraries of Arabic manuscripts, including numerous Quranic commentaries. West African oral traditions, the griot storytellers who preserve history through memorization, embrace Quranic memorization naturally. The skills transfer. Those trained to memorize genealogies and epic poems easily memorize the Quran. The tradition of writing Quranic verses on wooden boards develops elaborate form in West Africa. These boards are not just learning tools but protective amulets. People believe Quranic verses carry power. They protect from evil, heal illness, bring blessing. So verses are written on paper, sewn into leather pouches, worn on the body. Or verses are written on boards, the ink is washed off, the water containing dissolved words is drunk, ingesting the Quran literally. Orthodox scholars often criticize these practices as superstition, but they reveal deep belief in the Quran's power. The words are not merely information, they are force, presence, protection. To carry Quranic verses is to carry divine speech with its inherent potency. Across all these cultures, Spanish, Turkish, Persian, Indian, Southeast Asian, African, certain Quranic chapters and verses achieve special status. Al-Fatiha, the opening chapter, is universally central. Its 7 verses are recited in every prayer, whispered in times of need, read over food to bless it, recited when beginning any significant undertaking. Ayat al-Kursi, the throne verse, becomes most famous single verse. God, there is no God but He, the living, the self-sustaining, neither slumber nor sleep overtakes Him. To Him belongs all that is in the heavens and earth. Who can intercede with Him except by His permission? He knows what is before them and what is behind them, while they encompass nothing of His knowledge except what He wills. His throne extends over the heavens and earth, and their preservation does not tire Him. He is the Most High, the Magnificent. This verse appears everywhere, calligraphed on mosque walls, engraved on jewelry, printed on posters in shops and homes, recited before sleep for protection. Muslims believe it is the Quran's most powerful verse, that reciting it creates protective barrier against harm. Surah Yasin chapter 36 is called the heart of the Quran. It emphasizes resurrection and God's signs in creation. Muslims recite it for the dying, believing it eases the soul's departure. They recite it on Friday evenings. They recite it when seeking God's help for specific needs. The chapter becomes associated with blessing and mercy. The last 2 chapters, the Mu'awwidhatain, are brief verses seeking refuge in God from evil. They are recited for protection, particularly for children. Parents breathe these verses over their babies, believing the words shield against harm. But beyond specific chapters, certain Quranic themes resonate differently in different cultures. Sufi mystics emphasize verses about God's love and nearness. We are closer to Him than His jugular vein. Reformers emphasize verses about justice and equality. Activists quote verses about enjoining good and forbidding wrong. Scholars focus on verses commanding knowledge and reflection. The Quran remains unchanged, same Arabic words in every mosque worldwide, but its living meaning shifts with context. A verse about patience speaks differently to a refugee fleeing war than to a wealthy merchant making business decisions. A verse about God's mercy resonates differently for someone grieving loss than someone celebrating birth. This flexibility is not weakness but strength. The Quran's ability to speak meaningfully to vastly different situations across 14 centuries and countless cultures reveals something profound about the text's construction. Its themes are universal enough to transcend specific time and place. Its language is rich enough to sustain multiple interpretations. Its structure is open enough to allow emphasis on different aspects according to need. Yet underlying this diversity remains unity. A Muslim in Morocco and a Muslim in Malaysia may practice Islam somewhat differently, may interpret certain verses differently, may express their faith through different cultural forms, but they share the same Quran. They pray toward the same Mecca. They recite the same Fatiha. They fast the same Ramadan. They recognize each other as part of the same Ummah, the global community bound together by submission to the same revelation. Walk into a mosque anywhere in the world, and you will hear the same recitation. The language might be incomprehensible to locals who speak only Indonesian or Turkish or Swahili, but the Arabic endures, creating linguistic unity across ethnic diversity. The Quran in Arabic is the common ground, the shared treasure, the universal reference point. This is the Quran's remarkable achievement, to remain fixed while spawning infinite cultural expressions, to be one book speaking 1,000 languages, to unite through consistency while allowing diversity to flourish around that unchanging core. But the modern world would test this unity in unprecedented ways. Colonialism, nationalism, technological revolution, globalization, all would challenge traditional Muslim relationships with the Quran. The 20th century would transform how Muslims encountered their sacred text, creating both crises and opportunities. This is where our journey turns next, to the Quran in modernity, to sacred text meeting technological transformation, to ancient words navigating contemporary challenges. In the year 1906, something remarkable happens in Cairo. For the first time in history, the Quran is recorded. A reciter named Sheikh Muhammad Rifat stands before a recording device, a mechanical marvel that can capture sound on wax cylinders, and begins to recite. His voice, which thousands have heard in Cairo's mosques, will now reach beyond the walls, beyond the city, beyond even his own lifetime. Consider what this means. For 13 centuries, hearing the Quran required physical presence. You had to be in the same space as the reciter. The sound waves travelled from mouth to ear, then dissipated. But now, that voice can be preserved, reproduced, carried across continents. The Quran is about to become ubiquitous in ways previous generations could never imagine. The technology spreads rapidly. By the 1920s, radio broadcasts carry Quranic recitation into homes across the Muslim world. Families who could not afford to travel to famous reciters can now hear them daily. The blind and elderly who cannot attend mosques can still experience live recitation. The technology democratizes access to something previously limited by geography and mobility. Egypt becomes the center of this revolution. The Egyptian radio begins broadcasting complete Quran recitations during Ramadan, dividing the entire text across the month's 30 nights. Families gather after breaking their fast, sitting together in the evening cool, letting the verses wash over them. The radio becomes the modern equivalent of those early gatherings in Medina community formed around listening to divine speech. Star reciters emerge. Sheikh Abdul Basit, Abdul Samad, develops a style so moving that his recordings spread worldwide. His voice, deep, controlled, capable of stunning melodic range, becomes synonymous with Quranic recitation for millions. Sheikh Mahmoud Khalil al-Husari creates recitations specifically for teaching, with slow, clear pronunciation perfect for students. Sheikh Mustafa Ismail brings unprecedented emotional intensity, his recitations causing listeners to weep openly. These men become celebrities. When Abdul Basit travels to perform, thousands attend. His recitations are broadcast live, discussed in newspapers, analyzed by critics. He is not merely a religious figure but cultural icon. The Quran, through his voice, becomes part of popular culture in ways that both inspire and trouble traditional scholars. The cassette tape revolution of the 1960s and 70s amplifies this transformation. Now anyone can own recordings of their favorite reciters. The cassette is portable, durable, reproducible. Taxis in Cairo play Quran tapes instead of music. Shops in Jakarta use them as background sound. Pilgrims to Mecca bring home tapes of the grand mosque's imams. The Quran becomes omnipresent sonic environment. But something else happens with recording technology: standardization. When millions hear the same reciter, regional variations diminish. The Egyptian style, refined, melodious, technically precise, becomes global norm. A young Indonesian learning to recite might model themselves on Abdul Basit rather than local reciters. Unity increases, but diversity of recitation traditions begins to fade. Television brings new dimension. Now you can watch reciters, see their faces, observe their physical presence, notice how they close their eyes during particularly moving passages, or how their bodies sway slightly with the rhythm. International Quran competitions become televised events. Millions watch teenagers from around the world demonstrate their mastery. The competitions are judged like Olympic events, points for pronunciation, melodic skill, voice quality, emotional impact. These competitions transform young reciters into overnight celebrities. A 15-year-old from Indonesia wins first place and returns home to heroes' welcome. His photograph appears on magazine covers. Government officials honor him. Universities offer scholarships. He has achieved fame through Quranic recitation, traditional religious skill meeting, modern media apparatus. But the 20th century brings something more revolutionary than recording technology: translation. For 13 centuries, the Quran existed primarily in Arabic. Non-Arabs might read translations to understand meaning, but these were considered interpretations, not the Quran itself. The Quran was Arabic, and Arabic was the Quran. The translation explosion changes this. By century's end, the Quran has been translated into over 100 languages. Some translations are literal, trying to capture exact meaning. Others are interpretive, explaining context and implications. Some emphasize poetic beauty. Others prioritize clarity for modern readers. This creates tension. Can translation ever capture the original? The Quran's linguistic miraculousness, the claim that its Arabic is inimitable, seems to evaporate in translation. The sound patterns disappear. The multiple meanings collapse into single interpretations. The rhythmic beauty becomes prose. Muslims debate whether reading translation counts as reading Quran. Orthodox position: no, only Arabic is truly Quran. Translation is merely interpretation. Progressive position: while Arabic remains original and ideal, translations make the message accessible to those who cannot master Arabic. Pragmatic position: for non-Arabs, translation is better than nothing, a bridge to the original rather than replacement for it. The debate reveals deeper anxiety about authenticity in modern age. If someone reads the Quran in English and feels moved, have they encountered divine speech or merely human interpretation? If they base their understanding on translation, are they getting Islam or a translator's version of Islam? Yet translations proliferate because the Muslim world is no longer primarily Arab. Of nearly 2 billion Muslims worldwide, only about 20% are native Arabic speakers. The vast majority encounter the Quran first in translation, then perhaps learn to recite without understanding, then maybe study Arabic to access the original. Translation becomes necessary even as it remains controversial. The internet transforms everything again. By the late 1990s, websites offer the complete Quran with multiple translations side by side. You can read a verse in Arabic, then see how 10 different translators rendered it in English. You can compare interpretations, trace how meaning shifts across translations, study the original with unprecedented access to scholarly resources. Digital Qurans appear software and websites providing search functions, bookmarks, translation comparisons, recitation audio, commentary from classical scholars. You can search for every occurrence of a word across the entire text. You can find all verses about a particular theme. You can study how a concept develops from Meccan to Medinan revelations. Tools that would have required years of page-turning now take seconds. Smartphone apps bring the Quran into everyone's pocket. The app knows your location and can determine Mecca's direction for prayer. It can calculate prayer times based on your coordinates. It can alert you when time for prayer arrives. The Quran becomes integrated with daily life in historically unprecedented ways. Online Quran classes connect students globally with traditional teachers. A woman in Texas can study Quranic Arabic with a scholar in Cairo via video call. A teenager in Australia can memorize under guidance of a teacher in Pakistan. Geography no longer limits access to traditional Islamic education, but the internet also democratizes interpretation. Anyone can post their understanding of a verse. Untrained amateurs offer Quranic commentary alongside established scholars. The traditional gatekeeping function of religious authorities weakens. Some see this as liberation, direct access to scripture without clerical mediation. Others warn of chaos, unqualified, people spreading misinterpretation and heresy. Social media spreads Quranic verses as daily inspiration. Muslims share favorite verses on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. A verse about patience appears after a tragedy. A verse about gratitude accompanies a beautiful sunset photo. A verse about knowledge circulates among students during exams. The Quran becomes part of digital social interaction, snippets shared and liked and commented upon. Critics worry about decontextualization. A verse quoted in isolation can seem to mean something quite different from its meaning in context. The Quran's complex literary structure, with themes recurring across chapters, with verses commenting on other verses, with later revelations modifying earlier ones, requires careful reading. Social media's snippet culture threatens this depth. Modern Muslims navigate bewildering interpretive diversity. Progressive scholars argue the Quran supports gender equality, religious pluralism, and democratic governance. Conservative scholars insist on traditional readings about gender roles, Islamic State, and strict legal interpretations. Extremists cite verses about fighting to justify terrorism, while mainstream scholars explain these verses' historical context and defensive nature. The same Quran that has united Muslims for 14 centuries now seems to generate endless disagreement. Is this new? Or has the Quran always contained multitudes? Only now the debates are more visible, more public, conducted in global media rather than private scholarly circles. Women's relationship with the Quran undergoes particular transformation. Traditionally, Quranic scholarship and recitation were male domains. Women memorized and recited privately, but rarely in public roles. The 20th century changes this gradually, then rapidly. Female reciters emerge, though they remain controversial. Can women recite publicly? Orthodox opinion: no. A woman's voice might tempt men, so she should recite only for other women. Progressive opinion: the Quran sets no such restriction. Women should recite publicly like men. Pragmatic solution. Women recite in women-only gatherings or on recordings rather than live before mixed audiences. Female scholars of the Quran become more visible and numerous. Women with traditional training in Quranic sciences, tajweed, tafsir, hadith, begin teaching publicly, writing books, appearing on television. Some focus on recovering women's voices in Islamic tradition. What did Aisha, the Prophet's wife and major hadith transmitter, say about Quranic interpretation? Others offer feminist readings that challenge patriarchal interpretations while remaining within Islamic framework. The debates grow fierce. Does the Quran mandate gender hierarchy, or gender complementarity, or gender equality? Is hijab Quranic requirement or cultural tradition? Can women lead prayers that include men? Can they serve as imams, qadis, muftis? The Quran becomes battleground for competing visions of Islam's gender norms. Meanwhile, the Quran maintains its traditional roles even amid technological change. It is still recited at births, the call to prayer whispered in a newborn's ear, the words Muslims want their children to hear first. It is still recited at deaths, verses about returning to God, about paradise awaiting the righteous, about divine mercy. The Quran marks life's passages, as it always has. Muslim weddings still feature Quranic recitation verses about love, partnership, mutual respect. The ceremony is framed by divine speech, reminding the couple and witnesses that marriage is religious covenant, not merely social contract. In times of crisis, Muslims turn to the Quran for comfort. After September 11, when Muslims faced unprecedented hostility in the West, many found solace in verses about patience, about prophets who were rejected and persecuted yet remained faithful. During natural disasters, verses about God's mercy and wisdom in calamity provide framework for grief. The Quran shapes political discourse too. Islamist movements quote verses about establishing God's law on earth, about the Jahiliyyah ignorance of secular societies, about the necessity of Islamic governance. Secular Muslims quote verses about no compulsion in religion, about religious diversity as divine will, about consultation and justice. The same text grounds contradictory political visions. In conflict zones, Palestine, Kashmir, Chechnya, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Quran becomes battle cry and prayer simultaneously. Fighters recite verses before combat. Victims recite verses while dying. Survivors recite verses while grieving. The text that originated amid persecution and conflict in 7th century Arabia speaks with painful relevance to 21st century violence. Yet for most Muslims, the Quran remains less about politics or theology and more about daily devotion. It is the words recited in 5 daily prayers. It is the chapter read on Friday mosque visits. It is the verses memorized in childhood and never forgotten. It is the sound of a father's voice teaching his daughter to recite, just as his father taught him. The physical Quran maintains its sacred status despite digital abundance. Muslims still keep a printed Quran in their homes, still place it on the highest shelf, still handle it with ritual purity. When moving house, the Quran is often the first item packed, and the last item unpacked. You do not leave divine speech unattended. When traveling, many Muslims carry a small Quran, finding comfort in its physical presence. The Quran shapes aesthetic preferences that extend beyond religion. Muslims often prefer geometric and calligraphic art patterns and words, rather than representational images. This aesthetic, rooted in Quranic culture's prohibition on idolatry, influences everything from carpet design to architectural decoration. Language itself remains saturated with Quranic phrases. Muslims begin tasks with Bismillah in the name of God from the Quran's opening. They express hope with Inshallah, if God wills, from numerous Quranic verses. They respond to good news with Alhamdulillah, praise be to God, from the Quran's first chapter. These phrases are not conscious quotations but linguistic furniture of Muslim life. Quranic words integrated so deeply they become automatic. Even non-practicing Muslims, those who rarely pray or fast, often maintain reverence for the Quran. They might not read it regularly, but they will not disrespect it. They might not follow its commandments strictly, but they will not hear it insulted. The text carries weight that transcends individual religiosity. Muslim children grow up with the Quran as ambient presence heard in homes, mosques, streets, shops. Its rhythms become familiar before its meanings are understood. The sound of recitation becomes associated with safety, community, identity. Even if they later question or reject Islamic practice, the sound of Quranic recitation often retains emotional power. This is the Quran's enduring mystery, how it remains both ancient and contemporary, both fixed and flexible, both text and presence, how it can be dissected by scholars and intuitively grasped by illiterates, how it can generate endless controversy while providing stable center for nearly 2 billion people's lives. As the 21st century progresses, the Quran continues adapting to new contexts while remaining unchanged. It is recited in space stations and transmitted across the internet. It is studied in universities and memorized in refugee camps. It is debated in parliaments and whispered in hospital rooms. The words first spoken in a cave 1400 years ago have become humanity's most recited text, preserved in more hearts than any other document, translated into more languages than any ancient scripture. And for Muslims worldwide, it remains what it has always been, the voice of God, speaking across time, addressing each generation, calling each individual to reflection, submission, and transformation. This eternal presence in Muslim life, this constant call that shapes identity, structures, time, provides meaning, and creates community, is what we explore in our final chapter. The Quran not as historical artifact or theological proposition, but as living reality, as the heartbeat of a global civilization, as the words that Muslims carry with them from birth to death and beyond. Walk into a Muslim home anywhere in the world, from a Jakarta apartment to a Moroccan riad, from a Detroit suburb to a village in northern Nigeria, and you will likely find the same thing. Somewhere, usually elevated, often wrapped in decorative cloth, rests a physical Quran. It may be ornate or simple, large or pocket-sized, ancient or recently printed, but it is there. This presence is more than symbolic. The Quran in a Muslim home is not merely a book that happens to be religious. It is a portal to the divine, a piece of sacred geography, a constant reminder of what grounds this household's existence. Children learn early. The Quran goes on the highest shelf, above other books, above worldly things. You do not place objects on top of it. You do not turn your back to it disrespectfully. It occupies space differently than other possessions, but the Quran's presence extends far beyond this physical object. It saturates Muslim consciousness in ways both obvious and subtle, shaping how Muslims move through the world even when they are not actively reading or reciting it. Listen to Muslims speak. Within minutes, you will hear phrases that originate in the Quran but have become so integrated into daily language that speakers barely register them as quotations. Bismillah, in the name of God, before beginning any task, from starting a car to opening a book to taking the first bite of food. The phrase comes from the Quran's opening, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, inshallah, if God wills, when discussing future plans. I will see you tomorrow, inshallah. The phrase acknowledges that humans propose but God disposes, that nothing is certain except what the divine allows. It comes from a Quranic verse commanding believers not to say, I will do such and such tomorrow, without adding, if God wills. Alhamdulillah, praise be to God, in response to any question about well-being. How are you? Alhamdulillah. The phrase comes from the Quran's opening chapter, and its use has become automatic, a reflexive gratitude woven into greeting rituals. Subhanallah. Glory be to God when witnessing something remarkable. A spectacular sunset, news of a scientific discovery, a child's first steps all might elicit this phrase. It expresses wonder while attributing that wonder's source to the divine. These phrases pepper conversation across languages. An Indonesian Muslim speaking Bahasa will drop in Arabic Quranic phrases. A Turkish Muslim speaking Turkish will do the same. A Nigerian Muslim speaking Hausa, a British Muslim speaking English. All will unconsciously salt their speech with words from the Quran. The text has become the background music of Muslim linguistic life, but the Quran's presence manifests in more profound ways too. It provides the framework through which Muslims interpret existence itself. The Quran describes life as test, death as return to God, success as achieving, divine pleasure, failure as earning divine displeasure. This worldview shapes how Muslims experience everything, from job loss to illness to political upheaval. When a Muslim faces hardship, the Quranic framework offers both explanation and comfort. This difficulty is a test. Do people think they will be left alone because they say, "We believe," and they will not be tested? Patience in adversity brings reward. God is with those who patiently persevere. Every difficulty conceals hidden benefit. Perhaps you dislike something which is good for you. These are not merely consoling platitudes. They are fundamental reorienting of experience. Suffering is not meaningless but purposeful. Loss is not final defeat but temporary setback. Death is not oblivion but transformation. The Quran provides narrative structure for human experience, making the chaos of existence interpretable. Consider how the Quran frames time itself. The Islamic calendar begins not with Muhammad's birth or the first revelation, but with the Hijra, the migration to Medina. This choice reveals Quranic priorities. The community's foundation matters more than individual biography. Time is measured from when Muslims first established a society ordered by revelation. The Islamic week pivots around Friday Jumu'ah, literally gathering when Muslims assemble for communal prayer featuring a sermon. The Quran commands this. When the call to prayer is made on Friday, hasten to the remembrance of God and leave off business. For Muslims, Friday occupies the place Saturday holds for Jews, and Sunday for Christians, the weekly rhythm organized around sacred obligation. The Islamic year structures itself around Ramadan, the month when the Quran was first revealed. During Ramadan, time feels different. The daily rhythm inverts wake before dawn to eat, fast through daylight hours, break fast at sunset, perhaps attend extended evening prayers. The month becomes intensive Quranic immersion, with the entire text recited in nightly prayers, extra recitation during the day, particular emphasis on Laylat al-Qadr, the night of power when the Quran's revelation began. Muslims describe Ramadan as feeling closer to God, more spiritually aware, or community connected. This is the Quran's doing. The fasting and prayer are Quranic commandments. The night prayers feature extended Quranic recitation. The month commemorates the Quran's arrival. Ramadan is lived Quran, embodied submission to divine command. Life's major passages receive Quranic framing. When a child is born, the call to prayer is whispered in their right ear, the first sound they hear being the words "God is greatest" and the Shahada, the declaration of faith that echoes Quranic theology. The Quran thus greets the soul entering the world. When someone dies, the Quran accompanies their departure. Verses about death and resurrection, about God's mercy and judgment, about the soul's return to its Creator. These are recited at the bedside, whispered into the dying person's ear, read at the funeral. The Quran bookends human life, present at both entrance and exit, Muslim weddings feature Quranic verses about marriage, and among his signs is that he created for you mates from among yourselves, that you may dwell in tranquility with them, and he has put love and mercy between you. The marriage becomes not merely social contract but fulfillment of divine plan, two people joining in pattern established by revelation. When Muslims move into a new home, they often hold a Quran recitation gathering, inviting friends and family to fill the space with divine words before filling it with furniture. When opening a business, Quranic verses might be displayed, framing the commercial enterprise within sacred context. When a child completes memorizing the Quran, the celebration rivals or exceeds birthday parties. This is achievement that matters eternally, not merely temporally. The Quran shapes aesthetic sensibilities in ways Muslims might not even recognize. The preference for geometric patterns over representational art, rooted in concern about idolatry, stems from Quranic emphasis on God's absolute transcendence and incomparability. The love of calligraphy words as visual art emerges from Quranic reverence. The appreciation for Arabic's rhythmic beauty traces to centuries of hearing the Quran recited. Islamic architecture reflects Quranic priorities. Mosques face Mecca because the Quran commands prayer toward the Kaaba. Mosques include ablution facilities because the Quran requires ritual purity before prayer. Mosques feature mihrabs, prayer niches decorated with Quranic calligraphy. The building itself becomes three-dimensional Quran, space organized around facilitating the activities the Quran commands. Even Muslim names carry Quranic presence. Parents name children after prophets mentioned in the Quran: Ibrahim, Musa, Isa, Maryam. They choose names with meanings that reflect Quranic values. Sabir means patient, Rahim means merciful, Nur means light. To introduce yourself as a Muslim is often to invoke a piece of revelation, to carry a name weighted with sacred story. The Quran creates community across vast distances and cultural differences. A Muslim in Brazil and a Muslim in Bangladesh may share no common language, may practice Islam somewhat differently, and may never meet. But they both know Al-Fatiha. They both recite the Shahada. They both fast Ramadan. They both recognize each other as part of the Ummah, the global community bound by shared submission to divine revelation. This is not abstract theology. When Muslims travel, they seek out mosques, knowing they will find familiar ritual. The prayer is the same everywhere, the movements, the Arabic recitations, the direction. A Muslim praying in Tokyo performs identical actions as a Muslim praying in Tehran or Toronto or Timbuktu. This is the Quran's unifying power, creating global community through shared practice, rooted in shared text. Yet the Quran also speaks intimately to individuals. Muslims describe certain verses as speaking directly to them, as if the revelation anticipates their specific situation. Someone struggling with faith encounters the verse, "O you who believe, do not betray God and the Messenger, nor betray your trusts knowingly." Someone grieving finds, "Indeed, to God we belong, and to Him we shall return." Someone celebrating receives, "Say, in the bounty of God and His mercy, in that let them rejoice." The text, composed 14 centuries ago, for a specific community in 7th century Arabia, somehow continues to feel personally relevant to billions of people across radically different contexts. This is either remarkable coincidence or evidence of the Quran's divine origin, depending on perspective. What is undeniable is the subjective experience of millions who find in these ancient words immediate, personal meaning. Muslims develop relationships with favorite verses, returning to them repeatedly for comfort, guidance, or inspiration. These become personal touchstones, verses that carried them through divorce or illness or exile, verses that reframe suffering or celebrate joy, verses that feel like divine communication aimed specifically at their heart. Some Muslims describe the Quran as companion present in solitude, speaking in silence, offering perspective when confusion reigns. They turn to it not merely for information but for presence, opening its pages or playing recitation, not to learn facts but to feel connection. This intimacy coexists with the Quran's public, communal functions. The same text that speaks privately to individuals also structures collective identity. It grounds legal systems, inspires political movements, defines cultural norms, shapes aesthetic traditions. The Quran is simultaneously personal and civilizational, intimate and monumental. Modern Muslims navigate unprecedented challenges while maintaining Quranic connection. Migration scatters families across continents, but they share verses through messaging apps. Secularization weakens traditional authority, but individual Quran reading increases. Globalization homogenizes cultures, but Arabic recitation preserves distinctiveness. Technology transforms everything, but the words remain unchanged. A Muslim woman in Canada, far from her Pakistani village, teaches her daughter the same verses her grandmother taught her. A refugee in Germany, having lost everything, still carries memorized Quran, the one possession that cannot be taken. A young professional in Dubai, rushing between meetings, pauses 5 times daily to recite verses in prayer. The contexts change radically, but the Quranic core endures. Even Muslims who struggle with faith, who question traditional interpretations, who live thoroughly secular lives, even they often maintain connection to the Quran. They might not pray regularly, but they still say Bismillah before eating. They might drink alcohol despite prohibition, but they still respect the physical Quran. They might marry non-Muslims, but they still want Quranic verses at their weddings. The text retains gravitational pull even on those who orbit at distance. For Muslims navigating modernity's complexities, balancing tradition and change, religious identity and professional demands, community expectations and personal authenticity, the Quran remains reference point. Not everyone agrees on what it says or means, but nearly everyone agrees it matters. The debates are fierce, precisely because the stakes are so high. This is not merely ancient text, but living guide, not historical document, but present voice. As we reach the end of this journey through the Quran's role in Muslim life, one truth stands clear. This is not a book Muslims simply believe in. It is a presence they live with. Not a text they occasionally consult, but a voice they constantly hear. Not doctrine they assent to, but reality they to inhabit. For nearly 2 billion people scattered across every continent, speaking hundreds of languages, practicing diverse cultural traditions, the Quran remains the constant. It is what makes a Moroccan Berber and a Malay fisherman recognize each other as brothers in faith. It is what connects a 7th century merchant in Mecca with a 21st century programmer in Silicon Valley. It is what allows a mother in Syria and a mother in Senegal to teach their children the same words, the same prayers, the same stories. The Quran that began in a cave outside Mecca, received by a man who could not read or write, preserved first in human memory, then codified in manuscripts, then spread across empires, then adapted to print, then recorded in sound, then digitized for global access. This Quran continues shaping hearts and minds and cultures in every corner of today's world. Its verses, first revealed amid persecution and warfare in 7th century Arabia, still resonate in refugee camps and palaces, in universities and prisons, in mosques and homes. Muslims recite it in moments of joy and sorrow, certainty and doubt, celebration and grief. It frames their understanding of where they came from, why they exist, and where they are going. This is the Quran's ultimate achievement, not merely surviving 14 centuries, but remaining vibrantly alive throughout them, not just being preserved, but continuing to transform those who preserve it. Not simply being transmitted, but creating the community that transmits it. Walk into any Muslim home, anywhere in the world, at any time of day or night. Listen carefully. Whether through the voice of someone praying, The sound of recitation from a device, the phrases woven into conversation, or simply the presence of the physical book resting on its high shelf, the Quran is there. It has been there for 14 centuries. It remains there today. And for Muslims, it will be there tomorrow and the day after. And for all the tomorrows to come, an eternal voice in time, divine speech echoing through human history, the words that once descended in a cave now carried in 2 billion hearts. This is the Quran's story. But more than that, it is the story of what happens when humans encounter what they believe is divine speech. It is the story of preservation and transmission, interpretation and controversy, unity and diversity, tradition and change. It is the story of how words shape worlds, how texts create civilizations, how revelation becomes reality, and the story continues.